Major General Robert Hayes had been stationed at Fort Bragg for 3 years, and in that time, he'd seen the face of warfare transform from something he understood, boots on the ground, tactical operations, clear lines of engagement, into an invisible battlefield that existed in networks, code, and digital shadows. The change unsettled him in ways he rarely admitted, even to himself. He stood now in the briefing room on the third floor of the Cyber Warfare Command Building, a structure that hadn't existed when he'd first joined the Army 30 years ago. The walls were lined with monitors displaying real-time threat assessments, network traffic analyses, and classified intelligence feeds from around the globe. Each screen told the same story. America's adversaries were getting better faster, more sophisticated in their digital attacks. "We're bleeding talent, sir," Lieutenant Jessica Morrison said, sliding another folder across the polished conference table. She was his aide, sharp as a tack and brutally honest, qualities Hayes valued above almost everything else. "That's the third analyst this month who's jumped to private sector. Google's offering twice what we can pay, and they don't require security clearances that take 18 months to process." Hayes picked up the folder without opening it. He knew what was inside: resignation letters, exit interviews, HR reports about recruitment challenges. The Cyber Warfare Division was hemorrhaging expertise at exactly the moment they needed it most. The Pentagon's latest threat assessment, the one that had cost him 2 nights of sleep, showed hostile actors probing military networks with unprecedented sophistication. Chinese state-sponsored groups, Russian intelligence operations, even non-state actors with funding and skills that rivaled national agencies. "What about the recruitment drive?" Hayes asked, though he already suspected the answer. Morrison's expression told him everything. "Out of 200 applicants, we got maybe 15 worth interviewing. Of those, 12 already have competing offers. 2 failed background checks." She paused. "And then there's the last one." "Show me." Morrison pulled out a thin file, noticeably lighter than the others. Hayes opened it and immediately understood her hesitation. The applicant photo showed a young woman, maybe early 20s, with a face that belonged on a farm more than a military installation. No makeup, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd spent more time looking at horizons than computer screens. "Sarah Chen," Morrison said, 22 years old, from Broken Bow, Nebraska, population 3,000. Hayes scanned the resume. High school diploma from a rural consolidated school, no college, no military service, no technical certifications, underwork experience, farm maintenance and equipment repair, Chen Family Farm, 2018 present. "This is a joke," Hayes said, not angrily, just stating what seemed obvious. "I thought so too," Morrison admitted, "but look at the attachment." Hayes flipped to the next page. It was a printed email from someone named Dr. Marcus Webb at the National Security Agency, flagged with a security classification that made Hayes sit up straighter. "General Hayes, I understand this recommendation will seem unusual. I discovered Miss Chen 6 months ago in an online mathematics forum where she was solving graduate-level encryption problems for recreation. When I presented her with a modified version of our analyst qualification test, anonymously, to avoid bias, she scored in the 99.7 percentile. Her approach to cryptographic problems demonstrates an intuitive understanding of pattern recognition and system vulnerabilities that I've rarely encountered, even among our top recruits. She has no formal training, which concerns me less than it should. I believe we're looking at a genuinely exceptional analytical mind. At minimum, she deserves an interview. Respectfully, Dr. Marcus Webb, Senior Cryptanalyst, NSA. Hayes read the email twice. Marcus Webb wasn't someone who wrote frivolous recommendations. The man had helped break enemy encryption during 3 separate conflicts and trained half the cryptographers currently working in military intelligence. "Did you verify this?" Hayes asked. Called Dr. Webb personally. He stands by every word. Says she's one of the most interesting minds he's encountered in 20 years. Morrison's tone suggested she remained skeptical despite the endorsement. Hayes looked at the photo again. Sarah Chen stared back at him with those clear, direct eyes. There was something in that gaze, not arrogance exactly, but a kind of quiet confidence that didn't match her resume. What's her story? How does a farm girl from Nebraska end up solving NSA-level encryption problems? Morrison consulted her notes. According to Dr. Webb's preliminary interview, she grew up on a cattle and wheat farm. Limited internet access, no money for college. Taught herself advanced mathematics using old textbooks she bought at library sales and estate auctions. Apparently, she'd work the farm during the day and study at night. Morrison looked up. She told Dr. Webb that she liked encryption because it reminded her of puzzles her grandfather used to give her. Despite himself, Hayes felt a flicker of curiosity. The military was desperate for cyber talent, and conventional recruitment clearly wasn't working. Maybe that was the problem. They kept looking for conventional candidates. Fine, he said, making a decision that felt simultaneously reckless and inevitable. 15 minutes, courtesy interview. If Dr. Webb thinks she's worth our time, I'll give her a shot to prove it. Morrison nodded, though her expression suggested she thought they were wasting time they didn't have. She's here, sir. Drove 14 hours from Nebraska yesterday. Been waiting in the lobby since 600. Hayes checked his watch, 8:30. The farm girl had been sitting downstairs for 2.5 hours without complaint. Send her up. As Morrison left to collect the candidate, Hayes walked to the window overlooking the base. Young soldiers moved in formation across the parade ground below, their movements precise and practiced. Everything about military life was designed to be measurable, quantifiable, predictable. You followed protocols, trusted your training, relied on proven systems. But warfare had evolved beyond protocols. The enemy didn't fight fair, didn't follow rules, didn't respect the systems that military doctrine was built upon. Maybe, just maybe, they needed someone who didn't think like everyone else. The door opened. Hayes turned around and Sarah Chen walked into his office wearing jeans, work boots, and a faded flannel shirt that had clearly seen better days. Her hands, he noticed immediately, were calloused and scarred, working hands. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look impressed by the surroundings or intimidated by his rank. She simply stood at a respectful distance and waited for him to speak. Miss Chen, Hayes said, thank you for coming. Please sit down. Thank you, sir, she replied, her voice carrying the flat vowels of the rural Midwest. She sat in the chair across from his desk, back straight but not rigid, hands folded calmly in her lap. Hayes decided to be direct. I'll be honest with you, your resume doesn't exactly scream cyber warfare analyst. For the first time, Sarah smiled, just slightly, just enough. No, sir, I expect it doesn't. So tell me why you're here. Sarah considered the question with the same calm she'd shown since entering. Dr. Webb told me that the military needs people who can think differently about security problems. I don't know if I'm that person, but I figured it was worth finding out. She paused. And I wanted to serve, sir. My grandfather was Army, Korea. He always said that if you had something to offer, you had an obligation to offer it. Hayes studied her for a long moment. There was no false modesty in her words, no rehearsed speech. She meant exactly what she said. All right, Miss Chen, he said, reaching for his tablet. Let's see what you can do. He had no idea that in the next 60 seconds, everything he thought he knew about warfare was about to change. General Hayes pulled his tablet from the desk drawer, the classified device that never left his possession. He'd planned to give Sarah Chen some basic scenario, maybe a simple network vulnerability assessment, something to politely demonstrate she was out of her depth before thanking her for her time and sending her back to Nebraska. But something about her composure irritated him in a way he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the waste of his time when the division was in crisis. Maybe it was the presumption that mathematical puzzles solved for fun translated to real-world military applications. Or maybe it was simply that she sat there so calmly, those farm girl hands folded in her lap, apparently unaware that she was completely unprepared for what he did. Lieutenant Morrison returned and took her position by the door, tablet in hand, ready to take notes. Hayes noticed her barely concealed skepticism. Good. He wasn't the only one who thought this was a waste of precious resources. Miss Chen, Hayes began, unlocking his tablet. The position we're trying to fill requires expertise in network security architecture, advanced cryptographic analysis, and real-time threat assessment under pressure. These aren't theoretical problems. When our systems are under attack, people's lives depend on split-second decisions made by analysts who have trained for years. I understand, sir, Sarah said simply. Hayes navigated to a classified training file, one of the scenarios used to evaluate senior analyst candidates. It depicted a simulated cyber attack on a military satellite communications network, multiple satellites in geosynchronous orbit, ground stations across 3 continents, encrypted data channels, redundant security protocols. The scenario included network diagrams, data flow charts, authentication sequences, and a deliberate vulnerability that candidates were expected to identify. The scenario typically took experienced analysts 15 to 20 minutes to work through, using specialized software and reference materials. It was far beyond what he'd normally show a candidate with zero experience, but Hayes had already decided this interview was over. Might as well make the point clearly. This is a simulated attack scenario on a satellite network, Hayes said, turning the tablet so Sarah could see the screen. I want you to identify the primary vulnerability and explain how an adversary might exploit it. He slid the tablet across the desk. Sarah leaned forward and looked at the screen. Her eyes moved across the display, the network topology, the encryption protocols, the authentication handshake sequences. Hayes watched her face for signs of confusion or panic. There were none. She studied the screen for perhaps 25 seconds, her expression neutral and focused. Then she did something that stopped Hayes cold. She closed her eyes. Miss Chen, he prompted. One moment please, sir, she said quietly, her eyes still shut. Hayes glanced at Morrison, who raised her eyebrows in an expression that clearly said, I told you this was a waste of time. He checked his watch, feeling his irritation mount. This was becoming absurd. Sarah sat perfectly still, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and even. Her lips moved slightly, as if she were speaking to herself, but no sound emerged. Her fingers tapped a subtle rhythm against her knee. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. A pattern Hayes didn't immediately recognize. This isn't a meditation exercise, Miss Chen, Hayes said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. I need you to analyze the scenario shows a vulnerability in the authentication protocol, Sarah said, her eyes still closed. Session token generation using a pseudorandom number generator seeded with timestamp data. An attacker with knowledge of the ground station clock synchronization could theoretically predict valid tokens. Hayes felt his irritation shift to surprise. That was the designed vulnerability, the one candidates were supposed to find. She'd identified it in under 30 seconds without taking notes, without using analysis software, without doing anything except looking at the screen and closing her eyes. But she wasn't finished. But that's not the real problem, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a quality that reminded Hayes of someone reading from a document only they could see. That vulnerability is too obvious. It's textbook. If this were a real scenario, an adversary sophisticated enough to attack military satellites wouldn't use such a conventional approach. Hayes leaned forward. What are you talking about? Sarah's eyes opened. They were completely focused, almost luminous with concentration. May I use your whiteboard, sir? Hayes gestured toward the large whiteboard that covered one wall of his office. Sarah stood and walked to it with purposeful strides. She picked up a blue marker and began drawing. What emerged on the board wasn't the network diagram from the tablet. It was something else entirely, a schematic that seemed to exist at a level of abstraction Hayes had never seen. She drew the satellite constellation first, not as simple circles but as nodes in a mathematical lattice, each one labeled with numbers that Hayes realized were orbital periods. Then she added the ground stations, but instead of showing them as fixed points, she represented them as time-variable functions. Her hand moved with absolute certainty, no hesitation, no corrections. She drew data flow arrows but annotated them with what appeared to be timing calculations. She marked propagation delays, encryption handshake windows, orbital mechanics. The satellites communicate with ground stations during specific windows based on orbital position, Sarah explained as she drew, her voice taking on a teacher's cadence. Each satellite has a primary and backup ground station. The handoff between stations during orbital transition creates a brief moment, approximately 3.7 seconds based on these encryption parameters, where authentication has to be reestablished. She drew 3 circles on the board in red marker, highlighting 3 specific points in the constellation. An adversary wouldn't attack the authentication protocol directly, Sarah continued. They'd wait for the handoff window and insert a timing attack here, here, and here. She tapped each red circle. By exploiting the orbital synchronization windows, they could inject false authentication tokens that would appear valid because they'd arrive at precisely the moment the system expects legitimate credentials. She stepped back from the board. The tokens would be accepted because the timing makes them indistinguishable from real credentials during the handoff chaos. Your enemy wouldn't need to crack the encryption or predict the random number generator. They just need to know orbital mechanics and have patience. The room had gone completely silent. Hayes stared at the whiteboard, then at his tablet, then back at the board. The scenario on his tablet was classified training material, developed by a team of experts over 6 months. It had a known vulnerability, the authentication flaw Sarah had mentioned first. But it also had a hidden test layer, something only 3 people knew about: Hayes, Colonel Rodriguez who designed the scenario, and the NSA liaison who'd approved it. The hidden layer was meant to identify exceptional candidates, analysts who wouldn't just find the obvious vulnerability but would think like an actual adversary and spot what wasn't explicitly shown. The timing attack vulnerability Sarah had just identified wasn't in any documentation. It wasn't supposed to be findable without running complex orbital mechanics calculations and cross-referencing them with encryption handshake protocols, work that required specialized software and usually took hours. She'd done it in her head in less than a minute. How? Hayes began, then stopped. Lieutenant Morrison was staring at the whiteboard with her mouth slightly open, her tablet forgotten in her hands. Sarah set down the marker and returned to her seat as calmly as if she'd just answered a simple arithmetic question. "I apologize if I overstepped, sir. You asked for the vulnerability. The first one seemed too easy, so I assumed you were testing whether I'd look deeper." Hayes found his voice. "Miss Chen, what you just described isn't in the scenario documentation." "I know, sir," Sarah said, "but it's there in the architecture. Once you see the orbital periods and the ground station positions, the timing windows become obvious. It's like—" She paused, searching for words. "It's like seeing a fence with a gate. Sure, someone might try to break through the fence, that's the authentication vulnerability. But if you know when the farmer opens the gate to let the cattle through, you don't need to break anything. You just walk through when it's open." The farm metaphor should have sounded absurd in a discussion of military satellite security. Instead, it was the clearest explanation of a timing attack Hayes had ever heard. He stood up and walked to his office door. "Lieutenant Morrison, get Colonel Rodriguez up here, right now." "Sir?" Morrison asked. "Now, Lieutenant, and tell him to bring the Olympus scenario files, all of them, including the classified addendum. As Morrison hurried out, Hayes turned back to Sarah Chen, the farm girl from Nebraska who'd just done something impossible. "Miss Chen," he said slowly, "I think we need to have a longer conversation." Colonel David Rodriguez arrived in General Hayes's office 7 minutes later, moving with the controlled urgency of a man who'd been summoned by a two-star general without explanation. He was 48 years old, MIT educated, holder of a PhD in cryptography, and the architect of Fort Bragg's entire cyber defense infrastructure. In his 20 years of military service, he'd briefed congressmen, trained NSA analysts, and published classified papers that had reshaped how the Pentagon thought about digital warfare. He was not accustomed to being caught off guard. "General," Lieutenant Morrison said this was urgent, Rodriguez said as he entered, carrying a secure tablet loaded with files. His eyes swept the room and landed on Sarah, taking in her civilian clothes and young face with barely concealed confusion. "Is this about the Hansen resignation? Because I think I can convince him to." "It's not about Hansen," Hayes interrupted. "Colonel, this is Sarah Chen. She's interviewing for an analyst position." Rodriguez's confusion deepened. "Sir, with respect, I have 3 critical security briefings this morning, and—" "Look at the whiteboard, David." The use of his first name made Rodriguez pause. Hayes only dropped formality when something significant was happening. The colonel turned toward the whiteboard and went very still. For a long moment, Rodriguez simply stared at Sarah's diagrams. His eyes traced the orbital mechanics, the timing calculations, the 3 red circles marking vulnerability points. Hayes watched the colonel's expression shift from confusion to concentration to something that looked uncomfortably like shock. "Who drew this?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "Miss Chen did," Hayes said. "About 3 minutes ago. I showed her the Olympus scenario on my tablet. She looked at it for maybe 30 seconds, closed her eyes, and then drew what you're seeing." Rodriguez turned to look at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. "The Olympus scenario, the training file." "Yes." "And you identified the authentication vulnerability?" Rodriguez asked Sarah directly. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, "but it seemed too obvious, so I looked for what else might be there." Rodriguez moved closer to the whiteboard, his finger tracing the annotations Sarah had made. "These calculations," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "The orbital handoff windows, the 3.7-second authentication gap. Where did you get these numbers?" "From the scenario, sir," Sarah said simply. "The satellite orbital periods were listed in the network diagram. The encryption handshake protocol was documented. Once you know how long it takes to complete an authentication sequence, and when the satellites transition between ground stations, the timing windows are just arithmetic." "Just arithmetic," Rodriguez repeated, his tone flat. He turned to Hayes. "Sir, can I speak with you privately for a moment?" Hayes nodded toward the outer office. "Miss Chen, please wait here. Lieutenant Morrison will get you some coffee." Once they were alone in the hallway, Rodriguez spoke in a low, intense voice. "General, what she described, the timing attack using orbital handoff windows, that's not in the standard Olympus scenario." "I know," Hayes said. "It's in the classified addendum, the one only you, I, and Director Chen at NSA have access to." Rodriguez pulled up a file on his tablet. "We created that vulnerability as a hidden test layer specifically to identify exceptional candidates. It requires cross-referencing orbital mechanics data with encryption protocols, running temporal analysis models, and understanding both satellite operations and network security at an expert level." "How long does it typically take analysts to find it?" Hayes asked, though he already knew the answer. "No one has found it, sir. Not in 8 months of running this scenario. We've had candidates with PhDs in aerospace engineering and computer science. They find the authentication flaw, the obvious one, and stop there." Rodriguez looked back toward the office where Sarah waited. She found it in under a minute, without using analysis software, without taking notes. How is that possible? Hayes had no answer. That's what I need you to tell me. They returned to the office. Sarah sat exactly as they'd left her, hands folded, expression calm. If she was nervous about being examined by two senior officers, she showed no sign of it. Rodriguez pulled a chair up and sat across from her, his tablet balanced on his knee. Miss Chen, I'm going to be direct with you. What you did is either extraordinary or you had access to classified information you shouldn't have. So I need to understand your methodology. I understand, sir, Sarah said without defensiveness. Walk me through it, step by step. How did you identify the timing vulnerability? Sarah nodded and took a breath, gathering her thoughts. When I looked at the scenario on the general's tablet, I saw the network topology first. 6 satellites in geosynchronous orbit, staggered at 60-degree intervals. Each one had listed orbital periods and ground station assignments. So far, that's all standard information, Rodriguez confirmed. Yes, sir. But orbital periods mean positions, and positions mean communication windows. If a satellite at position A needs to hand off to a ground station at position B, there's going to be a transition moment where the old connection drops and the new one establishes. That's basic satellite operations, Rodriguez said, his tone neutral but testing. The scenario also showed the encryption protocol, Sarah continued. Military-grade AES with a multi-stage handshake. I counted the stages. There were 5. Each stage requires a round-trip communication between satellite and ground station. Speed of light is about 300,000 kilometers per second. Geosynchronous orbit is about 36,000 kilometers up. Rodriguez's eyebrows rose slightly. You calculated signal propagation delay in your head. It's just division, sir. Round trip to geosynchronous orbit is about a quarter second. 5 handshake stages means 5 round trips, so about 1.25 seconds just for propagation. Add processing time at each end. The scenario listed the ground station hardware specs, so I estimated about half a second per stage. That's another 2.5 seconds. Total authentication time, 3.75 seconds. She said it as if she were explaining how to measure ingredients for a recipe. Rodriguez glanced at his tablet, pulling up technical specifications. The actual calculated authentication window for that encryption protocol is 3.73 seconds. He looked at Sarah with something approaching disbelief. You estimated that to within 20 milliseconds without using a calculator. I rounded, sir, Sarah said apologetically. I wasn't sure about the exact processing overhead. Hayes watched Rodriguez struggle to process what he was hearing. The colonel had spent his entire career around brilliant people, cryptographers, mathematicians, computer scientists. But there was something different about watching someone perform complex calculations with no tools, no computer, nothing but the mind behind those calm, steady eyes. All right, Rodriguez said slowly. So you calculated the authentication window. That still doesn't explain how you identified the handoff vulnerability. Once I knew how long authentication took, I thought about when it would be most vulnerable, Sarah explained. During steady-state operations, the satellites and ground stations have stable connections. But during handoffs, when a satellite moves from one ground station's coverage to another, the system has to re-authenticate with a new station while the old connection is dropping. That creates chaos. Chaos, Rodriguez repeated. Yes, sir. Organized chaos, but chaos. The system expects authentication to take 3.73 seconds. During handoff, there's overlap where both the old and new ground stations might be processing authentication requests. If an adversary knows the exact moment of handoff and injects false credentials timed to arrive precisely when the system expects real ones, the false credentials might be accepted because the timing makes them look legitimate. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her intensity quiet but unmistakable. It's like when you're herding cattle from one pasture to another. There's a moment when you open the gate and move them through. Everything's moving, there's noise and confusion, and if a cow from another herd slipped in right then, you might not notice until later because you're expecting cows to be coming through anyway. The farm metaphor again. Hayes found himself oddly grateful for it. It made the incomprehensible almost understandable. Rodriguez sat back in his chair, his professional skepticism warring with what he'd just witnessed. "Miss Chen, do you understand that what you just described, calculating signal propagation delays, estimating authentication windows, and identifying a timing attack vulnerability in a classified scenario, is graduate-level work? This is what we train people for years to do." "I'm sorry, sir," Sarah said, and for the first time she looked uncertain. "Did I do something wrong?" "Wrong?" Rodriguez let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "No, you didn't do anything wrong." He looked at General Hayes. The two men had worked together long enough that entire conversations could happen in a glance. Hayes saw Rodriguez's skepticism collapsing, saw the analytical mind accepting what seemed impossible simply because the evidence was undeniable. "General," Rodriguez said formally, "I recommend we continue this evaluation." General Hayes made a decision that would either validate the most unconventional recruitment in his career or expose him to ridicule from every senior officer at Fort Bragg. "Colonel Rodriguez, I want you to test her. Not a standard evaluation. I want you to throw everything you've got at her." Rodriguez's expression sharpened with professional interest. "Sir, are you sure? If we're going to do this properly, I'll need to use classified scenarios, real threat assessments." "Do it," Hayes said. "Lieutenant Morrison, clear the colonel's schedule for the next 2 hours, and I want this room locked down, no interruptions." Morrison hesitated at the doorway. "Sir, you have the Joint Chiefs briefing at 1100. "Reschedule it." Morrison's eyes widened fractionally. The Joint Chiefs didn't get rescheduled, but she simply nodded and left. Within minutes, the office was secured, additional classification warnings were posted, and Colonel Rodriguez had pulled up a series of files that made even Hayes uncomfortable. These weren't training scenarios. These were real-world threat assessments, some less than a week old, dealing with actual hostile actions against U.S. military networks. Sarah remained seated, her posture unchanged, watching the preparations with quiet attention. If she felt pressure, it didn't show. Rodriguez began with something relatively straightforward, a network intrusion attempt on a naval communications hub in San Diego. He displayed the attack signature, the malware analysis, and the forensic data on his tablet, then slid it across to Sarah. "Take your time," Rodriguez said, though his tone suggested he expected this to take considerable time. "Tell me what you see." Sarah studied the screen for perhaps 40 seconds. Then her eyes closed again. Hayes found himself holding his breath, watching for the same phenomenon he'd witnessed before. "Chinese origin," Sarah said after a moment, her eyes still shut. "But not state-sponsored. The code structure is too messy. Government operations are cleaner. This is either a contractor group or someone trying to look Chinese." Rodriguez's poker face cracked slightly. "Go on." "The malware uses a polymorphic encryption routine, changes its signature every few hours to avoid detection. But the base algorithm is old, maybe 5 or 6 years outdated. That's deliberate. Modern groups don't use old algorithms unless they're trying to hide their sophistication level." She opened her eyes and pointed at a section of code on the screen. "Here, this function call. It's using a deprecated library that was patched in 2019. No serious attacker would use it now unless—" She paused, tilting her head. "Unless they wanted the intrusion to be found and misattributed." Rodriguez pulled the tablet back and scrolled to a classified assessment attached to the file. His jaw tightened. NSA's analysis concluded this was likely a false flag operation by a Russian group using Chinese malware artifacts to misdirect attribution. It took them 3 weeks and a team of 12 analysts to reach that conclusion. He looked at Hayes. She got there in 90 seconds. Hayes felt something shift in the room. The fundamental assumption that this was some kind of elaborate coincidence was evaporating. Rodriguez, the skeptic, the MIT-educated cryptographer who'd seen every kind of analytical talent, was beginning to believe. "All right," Rodriguez said, his tone changing from testing to genuinely curious. "Let's go deeper." For the next hour, Rodriguez walked Sarah through scenario after scenario. A ransomware attack on Air Force logistics systems, a sophisticated phishing campaign targeting military contractors, a zero-day exploit found in satellite ground station software. Each time, Rodriguez presented the problem with minimal context, watching to see if Sarah would ask for additional tools, reference materials, or time to research. She never did. Instead, she would study the information briefly, close her eyes, and then describe what she saw with a clarity that bordered on unsettling. She identified attack vectors, traced malware to likely origin points, spotted vulnerabilities in network architectures, and described countermeasures with the confidence of someone reading from a manual only she could see. But what struck Hayes most wasn't just that she was correct, it was how she was correct. Her explanations never involved technical jargon or complex mathematical proofs. Instead, she used metaphors and analogies drawn from her farm experience. "This denial of service attack is like flooding an irrigation ditch," she explained at one point. "If you overwhelm the channel, the water backs up and nothing flows. But see this pattern here. The attacker is poolsing the flood in waves. That's not about blocking service. That's about watching how the system responds to find weak points in the drainage." Rodriguez had leaned forward, fascinated despite himself. "The system responses. Yes, they're probing for edge cases in the load balancer." "Like testing a fence," Sarah agreed. "You push on different posts to see which one's loose." The rural metaphors should have sounded absurd in a discussion of advanced cyber warfare. Instead, they cut through the technical complexity and revealed the underlying logic with startling clarity. Hayes realized that Sarah wasn't just analyzing systems. She was understanding them at a fundamental level that transcended the specific technology. Finally, Rodriguez pulled up a file marked with the highest classification level. "This is active," he warned. "We detected this intrusion attempt yesterday. It's still ongoing. We haven't fully analyzed it yet because we're trying to track the attacker without tipping them off that we've noticed." He showed Sarah the network logs, the anomalous traffic patterns, the subtle indicators that something was wrong. "Tell me what you see." Sarah studied the data for longer this time, nearly 2 full minutes. Her brow furrowed slightly, the first sign of uncertainty Hayes had seen from her. When she closed her eyes, her lips moved more rapidly, as if she were working through something complex. "This is different," she said finally, her eyes still closed. "The others were attacks, aggressive, trying to break in or disrupt. This is quiet, patient." "Explain," Rodriguez prompted. The traffic patterns look normal at first glance. Legitimate user behavior, proper authentication, nothing that triggers obvious alerts. But there's a rhythm underneath. Every 17 minutes, there's a micro spike in data requests. Not big enough to trigger volume alerts, but regular. Too regular. She opened her eyes. Someone's inside already. They're not trying to break in. They're mapping the network from the inside. The 17-minute interval is probably tied to shift changes or automated security scans. They're doing their reconnaissance during the brief windows when human attention is divided. Rodriguez's face had gone very still. He pulled up another screen, one showing the cybersecurity team's preliminary analysis from late last night. "We flagged the 17-minute pattern at 300 this morning. Our working theory was exactly what you just described. an insider threat, or a compromised credential being used for reconnaissance. He set down his tablet and looked directly at Sarah. "Miss Chen, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've worked with some of the brightest analytical minds in the intelligence community. What you're doing," he paused, searching for words. "How are you doing this?" Sarah's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. "I don't know how else to do it, sir. I've never had access to the kind of computers and software you all use. Growing up on the farm, we had dial-up internet that barely worked, and I couldn't afford college. So when I got interested in mathematics and codes, I had to learn to work problems in my head." She glanced at the bank of sophisticated monitors and computer systems visible through Hayes's office window. The Cyber Warfare Operations Center with its millions of dollars in technology. "Computers are powerful tools," Sarah continued. "I can see that, but they can also become a crutch. If you always rely on software to find patterns, you might stop seeing the patterns yourself, and computers have another weakness." "What's that?" Hayes asked. Sarah's expression was grave beyond her years. "They can be hacked, sir. They can be compromised, fed false data turned against you. Your enemy can cut your power, jam your networks, corrupt your systems." She tapped her temple. "But this, what's in here, can't touch that. They can't hack it, can't jam it, can't shut it down. Your mind is the one weapon that's always available, always secure as long as you're alive." The room fell silent. Hayes understood suddenly why Dr. Marcus Webb at the NSA had written that recommendation letter. This wasn't just about Sarah's analytical abilities. It was about a completely different approach to security thinking. In an age where warfare had become dependent on technology, Sarah represented something almost forgotten: the human element, refined to an edge sharp enough to cut through digital complexity. Rodriguez stood and extended his hand to Sarah. "Miss Chen, I apologize for doubting you. What you've demonstrated this morning is extraordinary." Sarah shook his hand, looking slightly embarrassed. "Thank you, sir, but I just answered some questions." "No," Rodriguez said firmly. "You did something most analysts take years to learn, and you did it without any of the tools they depend on." He turned to General Hayes. "Sir, I recommend we hire her immediately. Whatever position she wants, whatever we need to do to make it happen." Hayes nodded slowly. He'd reached the same conclusion. "Miss Chen, how would you feel about joining the Army's Cyber Warfare Division?" For the first time, Sarah smiled, really smiled, the kind of genuine expression that lit up her entire face. "I'd be honored, sir. When do I start?" "How about right now?" Hayes said. "We'll handle the paperwork and formalities later. Right now, I want you working with Colonel Rodriguez on that active intrusion you just analyzed. If someone's inside our networks mapping our systems, I want them stopped." Sarah stood ready to begin. "Yes, sir." As Rodriguez led her toward the Cyber Operations Center, Hayes caught Morrison's eye. His aide looked stunned, her usual professional composure shaken. "Lieutenant," Hayes said quietly, "make a note in Miss Chen's file. As of today, she's officially the most unconventional recruitment in the history of this command." "Sir," Morrison said, "I think she might be the most unconventional recruitment in the history of the entire military." Hayes watched Sarah disappear down the hallway, already deep in conversation with Rodriguez about network architecture and intrusion detection. "You might be right," Hayes said. "Let's hope we can keep her long enough to find out." Sarah Chen's integration into the Cyber Warfare Division was anything but smooth. Within 48 hours of her hearing, rumors had spread through Fort Bragg like wildfire. The farm girl with no degree, the general's pet project, the outsider who'd been handed a position that dozens of qualified candidates had competed for. Captain Eric Voss, a Yale-educated computer scientist with 6 years of military cyber experience, made his feelings clear during the morning briefing on Sarah's third day. "With respect, Colonel Rodriguez," he said, not bothering to hide the edge in his voice, We're dealing with nation-state adversaries using cutting-edge technology. How exactly is someone with zero formal training supposed to contribute to that fight? Sarah sat at the back of the operations center, at a simple desk that looked jarringly out of place among the rows of triple-monitor workstations. While other analysts had sophisticated computer setups running real-time threat analysis software, Sarah had a laptop she rarely touched, several legal pads, and a coffee mug filled with pencils. Rodriguez, to his credit, didn't rise to the bait. Captain Voss, Miss Chen has already provided valuable analysis on the network intrusion we've been tracking. Her insights are guesswork, interrupted Lieutenant Amy Park, another analyst with a PhD in cryptography from Stanford. She looks at data for 30 seconds and makes pronouncements. That's not analysis, that's intuition. And intuition gets people killed in this business. Sarah said nothing, her expression neutral as she organized her pencils by length. Hayes had warned her this would happen. Military culture valued credentials, experience, hierarchy. She had none of those things, and worse, her methods seemed almost deliberately designed to challenge everything the cyber division believed about their work. The skepticism went beyond professional disagreement into something more personal. In the break room, conversations would stop when Sarah entered. During team meetings, her suggestions were met with polite nods and immediate dismissals. When she tried to explain her analytical process, eyes glazed over at the farm metaphors and mental calculations. She's a circus act, Voss told his colleagues over lunch in the commissary, his voice carrying farther than he probably intended. The general brought her in to make some point about thinking outside the box, but this is serious work. We don't have time to babysit someone who thinks computer security is like fixing tractors. Master Sergeant Chen Williams, no relation to Sarah, despite the shared surname, was one of the few who didn't actively dismiss her. A former Army Ranger who'd retrained into cyber operations after an injury ended his infantry career, Williams had seen enough combat to respect unconventional approaches. "Give her a chance," Williams said quietly to Voss. "I've seen the general ignore protocol before, but never without good reason." "The good reason is probably politics," Voss replied. "Some congressman's daughter needs a job, so Hayes creates a position, and we all have to pretend she's qualified." Sarah heard about that comment third hand. She mentioned it to no one, simply returned to her desk and her legal pads, working through problems in her own way while the rest of the division ran their sophisticated algorithms and automated threat detection systems. 3 weeks into her tenure, the fragile peace shattered. It was a Tuesday morning, 8:47 hours. Sarah was at her desk, working through orbital mechanics calculations related to a new satellite deployment, when the first alarm sounded. Not the quiet ping of a minor alert, but the harsh klaxon that meant active, confirmed intrusion. The operations center exploded into controlled chaos. Analysts rushed to their stations, fingers flying across keyboards. Multiple screens flashed red warnings. Colonel Rodriguez emerged from his office at a run, his face grim. "What have we got?" he barked. "Multiple simultaneous intrusions, sir," Lieutenant Park reported, her fingers dancing across her keyboard. "Fort Benning, Fort Hood, Camp Pendleton, and here, all hit within the same 60-second window. Coordinated attack." "Signature," Rodriguez demanded. Captain Voss pulled up analysis screens. "Zero-day exploits, sir. Nothing in our threat database. The intrusion detection systems are flagging them but can't classify the attack vector. Whatever this is, it's new." Hayes arrived minutes later, alerted by automated emergency protocols. He took in the scene with a practiced eye, the flashing screens, the tense analysts, the feeling of barely controlled crisis that filled the air. "Status," he ordered. "We're under coordinated cyber attack across multiple installations," Rodriguez reported. "The malware is adaptive, Every time our systems try to block it, it shifts approach. Our AI threat detection is completely overwhelmed. It's learning from our defenses faster than we can respond. On the main display screen, a map of the United States showed red indicators blooming at military bases across the country. As Hayes watched, more appeared. Fort Carson, Naval Station Norfolk, Nellis Air Force Base. The attack was spreading. Communications, Hayes asked. Degraded but functional, Williams reported from his station. They're targeting our networks but haven't achieved full penetration yet. Whatever they're trying to do, we caught them early. Or they let us catch them, Voss muttered, his hands moving frantically across his keyboard. Sir, the attack patterns are incredibly sophisticated. This isn't some script kiddie or even a typical state-sponsored group. The code is elegant, adaptive, almost. He paused, searching for words. Almost alive. Can we isolate it? Hayes demanded. We're trying, Park said, frustration evident in her voice. But every time we cut off one vector, it finds another. It's like trying to catch water with a net. Rodriguez pulled up tactical displays, showing the attack spreading through military networks in real time. Sir, at this rate, we're looking at complete network compromise within the hour. Once they achieve that, they'll have access to everything: communications, logistics, operational planning. Options, Hayes snapped. We could do a hard shutdown, Voss suggested. Take all affected networks completely offline. It would stop the attack but also cripple our own communications. That might be exactly what they want, Rodriguez countered. Blind us, force us offline, then execute whatever they're really planning while we're dark. Then what do you suggest, sir? Park asked, her voice tight with stress. Rodriguez had no answer. Neither did anyone else. The best cyber warfare analysts in the U.S. military, armed with millions of dollars in sophisticated technology and AI-powered defense systems, were watching helplessly as an unknown adversary carved through their networks like a hot knife through butter. The operations center filled with the sound of desperate typing, urgent communications, and the steady ping of new alerts. On the main screen, the red indicators continued to spread. In the back corner of the room, unnoticed in the chaos, Sarah Chen sat at her simple desk. Her computer was off. The laptop screen was dark. While everyone else stared at monitors and ran analysis programs, Sarah's eyes were closed. Her lips moved silently. Her pencil tapped a rhythm against her notepad, a sequence that would have been recognizable to anyone paying attention. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. The Fibonacci sequence. Sir, we've lost Fort Bliss, Williams called out. Their networks just went completely dark. Same at Camp Lejeune, another analyst reported. They're not offline, they're compromised. The malware has full control. Hayes felt ice form in his stomach. This was beyond a typical cyber attack. This was surgical, devastating, and apparently unstoppable. He opened his mouth to give the order for a full emergency shutdown, the option that would blind the military but might be the only way to stop the hemorrhaging. Before he could speak, a quiet voice cut through the chaos. Colonel Rodriguez. Everyone turned. Sarah stood at her desk, her eyes open now, focused with an intensity that made Hayes's breath catch. She looked different, not like a nervous farm girl trying to fit in, but like someone who'd just seen something no one else could see. Colonel Rodriguez, Sarah repeated, her voice calm and absolutely certain. Take down network nodes 7, 14, and 23. Do it now. The room fell silent, except for the electronic alerts still screaming warnings. Miss Chen, Rodriguez began, we're in the middle of. Those 3 nodes, Sarah interrupted, and there was steel in her voice that hadn't been there before. Shut them down completely. Not isolated, shut down. You have to do it now, sir. Right now. Voss spun in his chair. We can't just randomly shut down network nodes based on a guess. Those nodes support critical communications across. "90 seconds," Sarah said, her eyes locked on Rodriguez. "Shut them down for exactly 90 seconds, then restore them in reverse order. 23 first, then 14, then 7. "That makes no sense," Park protested. "The attack is everywhere. 3 random nodes won't." "Not random," Sarah said flatly. She turned to the main display, pointing at the spreading red indicators. "Look at the pattern. The malware is using a Fibonacci timing sequence to coordinate its spread. The attacker built it into the code structure, probably a signature, something unique to identify their work. Those 3 nodes are the mathematical key points in the current propagation wave. If you disrupt them in sequence, you'll break the timing pattern and force the malware into its failsafe mode." Rodriguez stared at her. "You can see a Fibonacci sequence in network attack patterns." "I can see it because it's there, sir," Sarah said. "Please trust me. 90 seconds." The room held its breath. Hayes saw the calculation happening behind Rodriguez's eyes, the professional resistance to taking advice from an untested civilian, warring with the undeniable fact that nothing else was working and every second counted. "Do it," Hayes said, making the decision for him. Rodriguez's jaw tightened, but he nodded sharply. "Williams, you heard her. Take down nodes 7, 14, and 23. Full shutdown, 90-second count, restore in reverse order." "Sir," Voss started to protest. "Now, Sergeant," Rodriguez barked. Williams's hands moved across his keyboard, shutting down node 7, node 14, node 23, offline, 90-second timer starting, mark. The operations center plunged into even deeper crisis. The network map showed 3 major nodes going dark, communications dropping, critical systems losing connectivity. Multiple analysts looked at Sarah with expressions that mixed disbelief and anger. She just made everything worse. But Sarah simply stood at her desk, eyes closed again, counting silently. The seconds crawled past like hours, 89 seconds, 88, 87. The operations center felt like it was holding its breath. Master Sergeant Williams watched the countdown timer on his screen, while simultaneously monitoring the cascade of failures Sarah's recommendation had triggered. 3 critical network nodes dark. Communication channels disrupted across half a dozen military installations. Every instinct he developed over 15 years of military service screamed that they'd just made a catastrophic mistake. "Sir, we're getting emergency calls from Fort Hood," Lieutenant Park reported, her voice tight. "They're asking why their secure communications just went offline." "Tell them to stand by," Rodriguez ordered, but Hayes could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. The colonel's eyes were fixed on Sarah, who stood motionless at her desk, her lips still moving in silent calculation. Captain Voss had abandoned his own station and was now standing behind Williams, watching the network status displays with barely concealed fury. "This is insane," he muttered. "We just voluntarily crippled our own infrastructure based on, what? A farm girl's hunch about some pattern nobody else can see." 60 seconds, Williams announced. On the main display, the red indicators continued their relentless spread. Without nodes 7, 14, and 23 functioning, the military's network topology had gaping holes. The malware seemed to sense the weakness, concentrating its attacks on the disrupted areas like a predator sensing wounded prey. "They're hitting us harder," another analyst called out. "Attack intensity up 40% in the affected sectors." "Of course they are," Voss said. "We just opened the door for them, sir. We need to abort this. Bring those nodes back online before." 45 seconds, Williams interrupted. Hayes moved to stand beside Sarah. She hadn't moved, hadn't opened her eyes, hadn't acknowledged the growing panic around her. Her breathing was slow and measured, her pencil still tapping that same steady rhythm against her notepad. "Sarah," Hayes said quietly, using her first name for the first time, "are you sure about this?" Her eyes opened. They were utterly calm, completely focused, And in that moment Hayes saw something that reminded him of the best soldiers he'd ever commanded. That absolute certainty that comes not from arrogance but from having done the work, having seen what others missed. "It's already working, sir," Sarah said softly. "You just can't see it yet." 30 seconds, Williams called. "Working," Park said incredulously. "Look at the display. We're losing ground across every metric." But Sarah walked to the main display screen, ignoring the hostile stares from half the analysts in the room. She pointed at the spreading red indicators, her finger tracing a pattern that looked like random chaos to everyone else. "The attack is concentrating on the disrupted areas," Sarah explained, her voice taking on that teaching quality Hayes had heard before. "That's not because we made things worse. That's because we broke their timing pattern. Look, the malware was spreading in coordinated waves, each one synchronized with the Fibonacci sequence. When we took down those 3 nodes, we disrupted the mathematical rhythm they were using to coordinate the attack." "So what?" Voss challenged. "They just adapted and hit us harder." "No," Sarah said patiently. "They're not adapting, they're panicking. The malware was designed to spread using elegant, distributed coordination. But without the timing pattern, the different attack vectors can't synchronize properly. So they're all concentrating on the easiest targets, which happens to be the areas around our disrupted nodes." She turned to face the room. "Think of it like a cattle stampede. When the herd is running together, they're unstoppable. But if you disrupt the leaders at just the right moment, the herd loses coordination. They start bunching up, getting in each other's way, concentrating in one area instead of spreading out." 15 seconds, Williams announced. Rodriguez stepped forward, studying the display with new eyes. "You're saying the malware is getting in its own way?" "Yes, sir. The different attack components are interfering with each other because they can't coordinate without their timing pattern. And that means they're exposing their command structure," Rodriguez finished, his eyes widening. "When distributed systems fail, they fall back to centralized control. The malware is reaching back to its command and control server for new instructions." Sarah nodded. "Which means now we can see it. We couldn't trace the distributed attacks because they were too spread out, too coordinated. But if we force them into centralized mode—" 5 seconds, Williams said. 4, 3, 2, 1. Mark, 90 seconds elapsed. "Restore node 23, Sarah said immediately. Williams executed the command. On the display, node 23 came back online, its connection pathways lighting up green against the sea of red. The effect was immediate and visible. The concentrated attacks around that node suddenly stuttered, like a machine missing a gear. The red indicators flickered. "Now node 14, Sarah instructed. "Wait for it, wait, now." The second node restored. Another stutter in the attack pattern. Some of the red indicators actually blinked out entirely, malware components crashing as they tried to re-establish coordination that was no longer possible. "Node 7, Sarah said. "Now." The third node came online, and suddenly, impossibly, the tide turned. "I've got something," Lieutenant Park shouted, her earlier skepticism forgotten in the rush of discovery. "There, a command packet just transmitted to all affected networks. It's trying to resynchronize the attack components." "Trace it," Rodriguez ordered. "Tracing. I've got an IP address, routing through multiple proxies, but..." Park's fingers flew across her keyboard. "Got it. Command and control server located in Eastern Europe. Looks like Romania, but that's probably just another proxy." "Don't trace the location," Sarah said, moving quickly to Park's station. "Trace the mathematical signature. The person who built this malware loves the Fibonacci sequence. They used it in the timing pattern. They'll have used it elsewhere too. Look at the command packet structure itself." Park pulled up the packet data, lines of hexadecimal code streaming across her screen. For a moment, she just stared. Then, my God, the packet headers. They're using Fibonacci numbers for the sequence identifiers. It's completely unnecessary from a functional standpoint. It's just a signature. An artist signing their work, Williams said quietly. More than that, Sarah said. It's a fingerprint. Cross-reference that signature against known malware databases. This isn't the first time this person has attacked someone. Voss, who'd been silent since the nodes came back online, suddenly spoke up, running the cross-reference now. His voice had lost its hostile edge, replaced by professional focus. Multiple matches. This signature has appeared in attacks on financial institutions, tech companies, government agencies, going back 3 years. Same mathematical signature every time. Do we have attribution on any of those attacks? Rodriguez asked. NSA flagged it as a group called Golden Ratio, Voss read from his screen. Suspected Russian origin, but never confirmed. They're considered one of the top 5 most sophisticated threat actors in the world. Nobody's ever successfully traced them or countered their attacks before. Until now, Hayes said quietly. On the main display, the red indicators were rapidly disappearing. Without coordination, without their elegant Fibonacci timing pattern, the malware components were collapsing. Some were being isolated and quarantined by the military's automated defenses. Others were simply crashing, their code failing when forced into operational modes they weren't designed for. "Sir, we're regaining control," Williams reported, and there was wonder in his voice. "Fort Hood is back online. Camp Pendleton is secure. We're cleaning up the residual infections, but the active attack has been neutralized." The operations center erupted in controlled celebration, analysts confirming successful recovery, running security sweeps, documenting the incident for after-action reports. But Hayes noticed that several people were looking at Sarah with expressions that had completely transformed from skepticism to something approaching awe. Rodriguez walked over to where Sarah stood, slightly apart from the celebration, looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. The colonel extended his hand. "Miss Chen," he said formally, "I owe you an apology, we all do. What you just did." He paused, searching for adequate words. "You saw something nobody else could see and you saved us. You saved the entire network." Sarah shook his hand, her grip firm despite her obvious fatigue. "I just saw the pattern, sir. Once you see it, the rest is just arithmetic." "Just arithmetic," Rodriguez repeated, a slight smile crossing his face. "Miss Chen, what you call arithmetic, the rest of us call impossible." Captain Voss approached, his earlier hostility completely gone. "I was wrong about you," he said bluntly. "I'm sorry. What you did, identifying that Fibonacci pattern, predicting the failsafe behavior, forcing them into centralized mode, that was brilliant." "It was necessary," Sarah corrected gently. "The people who built that malware are sophisticated, but they're also proud enough to sign their work. That's a weakness, same as any other. You just have to know how to see it." Hayes stepped forward, and the room quieted. "Miss Chen, you just stopped the most sophisticated cyber attack this base has ever faced. An attack that was simultaneously hitting military installations across the entire country. And you did it by shutting down our own networks for 90 seconds based on a pattern you calculated in your head." He paused, letting the magnitude of that sink in for everyone present. "I don't think anyone in this room doubts your abilities anymore, but I need to understand something. You said you saw this while everyone else was running their analysis programs and AI detection systems. How? How did you see what millions of dollars in sophisticated technology missed?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the suddenly silent operations center. "Computers are powerful, sir. They can process data faster than any human, run complex calculations, detect patterns in huge datasets. But they do what they're programmed to do. They look for what they're designed to look for. The malware was sophisticated enough to hide from conventional detection. It was designed to exploit exactly the kind of automated systems we rely on." She gestured to her simple desk with its laptop, legal pads and pencils. I don't have those systems. I can't process data as fast or run automated scans, but I can think. I can look at the same information and ask different questions. When I saw the attack spreading, I didn't look at the individual intrusions or the specific exploits. I looked at the timing, the rhythm, the mathematical structure underneath. The Fibonacci sequence, Park said. Yes, but more than that, the elegance. This wasn't just an attack designed to steal data or cause disruption. It was beautiful in its way, sophisticated, artistic. That told me something about who built it, proud, confident, someone who couldn't resist leaving a signature. Sarah's expression was earnest, almost apologetic. I know my method seems strange. I know working without computers looks unprofessional, but computers can be hacked, compromised, fooled. The enemy in this case built malware specifically to defeat our technological advantages. They couldn't account for someone who wasn't using those advantages. She tapped her temple, echoing the gesture she'd made during her interview. This is the weapon they can't hack, can't compromise, can't predict, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's enough. The operations center remained silent as her words sank in. Hayes looked around at his team, analysts who'd spent years trusting in technology, in systems, in the sophisticated tools that modern warfare demanded. And he saw them reconsidering those assumptions, understanding that Sarah represented something they'd forgotten in their rush to embrace digital solutions. She represented the human element, unpredictable, adaptive, impossible to program against. All right, people, Hayes said, breaking the moment. We have an after-action report to compile and a network to fully secure. But before that, he turned to Sarah. I think we owe Miss Chen an apology and our thanks. Without her, we'd be completely dark right now, and God knows what would be happening across our military networks. One by one, the analysts who dismissed her, doubted her, resented her presence, stood and applauded. It wasn't the polite, obligatory applause of military courtesy. It was genuine, earned respect from people who just witnessed something they couldn't fully explain but couldn't deny. Sarah looked uncomfortable with the attention, her face flushing. But she stood there and accepted it, because she understood what Hayes understood. This moment mattered. The Cyber Warfare Division had just learned that their greatest weakness, their dependence on technology, had been countered by their greatest strength, a human mind that refused to be limited by conventional thinking. As the applause faded and the team returned to their work, Hayes pulled Sarah aside. "How are you really doing?" he asked quietly. Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "Tired, sir. Thinking like that, holding all those variables, running the calculations, seeing the pattern, it takes everything I have. I'll need some time before I can do it again." "Take all the time you need," Hayes said. "But Sarah, I need you to know something. What happened today is going to reach the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs, maybe higher. The military is going to want to understand what you can do. They're going to want to use it." Sarah met his eyes. "I understand, sir. I'm ready for that." "Are you?" Hayes asked seriously. "Because from here everything changes, for you, for this unit, for how the military thinks about cyber warfare." Sarah looked out at the operations center, at the analysts working to secure the networks she'd helped save, at the sophisticated technology that filled every corner of the room. "I came here to serve, sir," she said simply. "However I can help, I will." Hayes nodded, believing her. But he also felt a responsibility settling on his shoulders, the weight of having discovered something rare and precious, and knowing that he'd have to protect it from people who would want to use it up, burn it out, turn it into just another weapon. Sarah Chen was extraordinary. That much was now beyond question. The real question was, could the military handle what she represented without destroying what made her special in the first place? Part 7. The Counterattack. The war room at the Pentagon was designed to intimidate. Polished mahogany tables stretching 30 feet. walls lined with secure monitors displaying global military operations, leather chairs occupied by generals, admirals, and intelligence directors whose combined experience spanned centuries of warfare. At the head of the table sat General Marcus Whitfield, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man whose decisions shaped the future of American military power. Sarah Chen sat at the far end of the table in her newly issued Army uniform, looking profoundly out of place. It had been 72 hours since the Golden Ratio attack, 72 hours during which Sarah's actions had been analyzed, documented, and debated at the highest levels of military intelligence. The NSA wanted her. CYBERCOM wanted her. Even the CIA had made inquiries. And now she sat in the Pentagon, about to brief the Joint Chiefs on an operation that made General Hayes deeply uneasy. "Miss Chen," General Whitfield began, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in uniform. "We've read Colonel Rodriguez's after-action report. Impressive work stopping that attack, but what interests us more is what you found after." Sarah had spent the last 3 days doing something the military's entire cyber intelligence apparatus had failed to accomplish in 3 years. She traced Golden Ratio, not just their command and control servers or their proxy networks, but their actual operational infrastructure, the core of their organization. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "After we neutralized the attack, I analyzed the malware's mathematical signature more deeply. The Fibonacci sequence they used wasn't just decorative, it was functional. They embedded it into their entire operational structure." She stood and walked to the main display, where she'd prepared a presentation that looked nothing like the slick PowerPoint briefings these officers were accustomed to. Instead, it was a series of hand-drawn diagrams she'd photographed and uploaded, showing mathematical relationships and network structures. "Golden Ratio uses the Fibonacci sequence as an organizational principle," Sarah explained, pointing to her diagrams. "Their command structure, their communication timing, even their target selection follows mathematical patterns derived from the Golden Ratio, 1:618. It's elegant, sophisticated, and it makes them predictable if you know what to look for." Admiral Catherine Ross, head of U.S. Cyber Command, leaned forward. "Predictable how?" "They're preparing another attack," Sarah said simply. "A bigger one, within the next 96 hours. The room went very still. "How can you possibly know that?" demanded General Paul Henderson from the Air Force. Sarah walked them through her analysis. The timing of previous Golden Ratio attacks followed a Fibonacci-based schedule: 8 days, then 13, then 21. The Fort Bragg attack had been 21 days after their previous operation. The next interval in the sequence would be 34 days. "We're at day 31 right now," Sarah said. "Based on their pattern, they'll strike within the next 3 days, and based on the escalation in their previous targets, financial institutions, then tech companies, then military networks, the next target will be even more critical." "What target?" Whitfield asked. Sarah's expression was grim. "The power grid, specifically the Eastern Interconnection, the electrical grid serving everything from Maine to Florida. They've been positioning themselves for months. I found traces of their reconnaissance in utility company networks, power plant control systems, transmission station databases. They're not just planning to attack military networks this time. They're planning to attack civilian infrastructure." The implications hung in the air like a physical weight. The Eastern Interconnection served 120 million Americans. A coordinated attack on that scale could cause cascading failures, blackouts lasting weeks, economic damage in the hundreds of billions. "You found evidence of this infiltration in 3 days?" Ross asked, skepticism and hope warring in her voice. "My entire intelligence division has been hunting Golden Ratio for 3 years." "They were looking at the attacks themselves," Sarah said. "I looked at the mathematics underlying the attacks. Once you understand their organizational philosophy, their love of mathematical elegance, You can predict their behavior. Director James Chen of the NSA, no relation, spoke up. Even if you're right about the timing and the target, what do you propose we do about it? We can't shut down the entire Eastern power grid on a hunch. Not a hunch, sir, Sarah corrected gently. A calculated prediction based on observable patterns. Semantics, Henderson said. The point stands. We can't disrupt civilian infrastructure based on pattern analysis, no matter how sophisticated. Whitfield held up a hand, silencing the debate. What are you proposing, Miss Chen, specifically? Sarah took a breath. This was the part that had kept her awake for the past 2 nights, the part that made even General Hayes nervous. We don't wait for them to attack, sir. We attack them first. Explain, Whitfield ordered. I've traced their infrastructure. Not just the proxies and front servers, but their actual operational core. They're based in Romania, but their real command center is in St. Petersburg, Russia. I can give you exact coordinates. And I've identified a vulnerability in their own network. Ironically, the same Fibonacci-based timing pattern they love to use. If we hit them at exactly the right moment, we can take down their entire operation. Admiral Ross exchanged glances with Whitfield. You're talking about an offensive cyber operation against targets in Russia. That's an act of war. With respect, ma'am, Sarah said, they've already committed acts of war against us. Multiple times. We've just been too slow to respond. But now we have something they don't know we have. We understand how they think. We can predict their next move. And we can stop them before they cause catastrophic damage to civilian infrastructure. The political implications, Henderson began, are above my pay grade, sir, Sarah interrupted. I'm just telling you what's mathematically certain. Golden Ratio will attack the power grid within 3 days. We can either wait for them to strike and try to respond, or we can hit them first and prevent the attack entirely. Whitfield studied her for a long moment. You're very certain of this? Yes, sir. Based on mathematical patterns, Fibonacci sequences, the Golden Ratio. Yes, sir. Miss Chen, you've been in the military for less than a week. You have no formal intelligence training, no experience with international operations, no background in the political and strategic considerations that govern these decisions. Sarah met his gaze steadily. That's all true, sir, but I can see their pattern, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that if we don't act, 120 million Americans will be without power within 96 hours. Some of them will die, hospitals losing backup power, people freezing in winter weather, traffic systems failing. The economic damage will be catastrophic, and Golden Ratio will prove they can strike American civilian infrastructure with impunity. The room fell silent. Sarah remained standing, her hand-drawn diagrams displayed behind her, facing down the most powerful military commanders in the nation with nothing but her conviction and her calculations. Finally, Whitfield spoke. General Hayes, your assessment. Hayes stood from where he'd been observing near the door. Sir, I've watched Miss Chen work for the past week. I've seen her do things that shouldn't be possible. When she tells me something is mathematically certain, I believe her. That's not an assessment of the strategic situation, Henderson pointed out. No, sir, it isn't, Hayes agreed. Strategically, an offensive operation against Russian-based targets carries significant risk. Politically, it could create an international incident. But operationally, if Miss Chen is right, and I believe she is, we have a brief window to prevent a catastrophic attack on American infrastructure. We may never get this opportunity again. Whitfield turned to Director Chen, NSA's position. We've independently confirmed some of Miss Chen's findings, the director admitted. Not all. She's working at a speed and depth that frankly exceeds our capabilities. But what we have confirmed is accurate. If she says Golden Ratio is planning a power grid attack, I'm inclined to believe her. Cyber Command, Whitfield asked Ross. The Admiral's expression was conflicted. Sir, what Miss Chen is proposing is unprecedented. a preemptive offensive cyber operation based largely on mathematical pattern analysis. It goes against established doctrine, but she paused. The golden ratio attack on Fort Bragg should have succeeded. By all conventional analysis, we should have been completely compromised. Miss Chen stopped it using methods none of us understood at the time, and some of us still don't fully understand now. If she says she can stop the next attack, I think we have to listen. Whitfield sat back in his chair, the weight of decision visible on his face. Around the table, the most senior military leadership in America waited. Sarah stood motionless, her fate, and possibly the fate of millions of civilians hanging on whatever came next. "All right," Whitfield said finally. "We'll authorize a limited offensive operation. But Miss Chen, you'll be leading the technical aspects of this mission. If your analysis is wrong, if this escalates into an international incident, the responsibility will be yours." "I understand, sir," Sarah said. "I don't think you do," Whitfield replied, not unkindly. "You're 22 years old, you've been in the military for less than a week, and you're about to plan and execute a cyber attack against one of the most sophisticated hacking groups in the world, operating from Russian territory. This isn't stopping a defensive intrusion. This is offense. This is warfare." Sarah's voice was steady. "Sir, I grew up on a farm. I learned early that sometimes the best defense is fixing the problem at its source. You don't just patch the fence after the cattle get out. You find out where they're getting through and you fix it permanently. That's all this is. We know where the problem is. We know how to fix it. We just need to act." Another farm metaphor, but this time nobody smiled at the simplicity of it. "Very well," Whitfield said. "You have 72 hours to plan and execute this operation. General Hayes, you'll provide all necessary support and oversight. Admiral Ross, Cyber Command, will coordinate with Miss Chen's team. Director Chen, NSA, will provide intelligence support and help manage any diplomatic fallout." He stood, and everyone in the room stood with him. "Miss Chen, the President will be briefed on this operation. If you succeed, you'll have prevented a catastrophic attack on American infrastructure. If you fail," he left the consequences unspoken. "I won't fail, sir," Sarah said. As the meeting broke up and the senior officers filed out, Hayes approached Sarah. She looked smaller now, the weight of what she'd just taken on settling onto her shoulders. "You didn't have to volunteer for this," Hayes said quietly. "You could have just provided the analysis and let someone else execute." "No, sir," Sarah replied. "This is my pattern, my analysis. If I'm wrong, I need to be the one who faces the consequences. And if I'm right," she looked up at him, "if I'm right, then maybe we can stop thinking of cyber warfare as just defense and start thinking about how to actually win." Hayes recognized the steel in her voice. It was the same quality he'd heard from the best soldiers he'd ever commanded, the ones who understood that warfare wasn't about following rules or avoiding risks. It was about doing what needed to be done, regardless of the cost. "All right," he said, "let's go plan a counterattack." As they left the Pentagon war room, Sarah carried her folder of hand-drawn diagrams and calculations. Somewhere in St. Petersburg, the hackers of Golden Ratio were preparing their next attack, confident in their sophistication, their elegance, their mathematical precision. They had no idea that their own beautiful patterns had betrayed them, that a farm girl from Nebraska had seen through their art to the predictable human pride underneath. The invisible war was about to become very visible, and for the first time, America wasn't going to wait to be hit. They were going to strike first. The counterattack launched at 3:47 hours Eastern Time, precisely 33 hours before Golden Ratio's projected assault on the power grid. Sarah sat in Fort Bragg's operations center, surrounded by the best cyber warfare specialists in the military, her simple desk now positioned at the command hub where everyone could see her work. No computer, just legal pads, pencils, and a mind that had mapped every mathematical vulnerability in Golden Ratio's network. Initiating first phase, Colonel Rodriguez announced. His team executed Sarah's carefully calculated sequence, not a brute force assault, but a surgical strike that exploited the very Fibonacci timing patterns Golden Ratio had built into their own infrastructure. Sarah's eyes were closed, visualizing the attack flowing through networks she'd never physically seen but understood completely. "They'll detect the intrusion in 47 seconds, she said quietly. "Their automated defenses will activate at the 50-second mark. That's when you deploy the second payload." Captain Voss, once her harshest critic, now watched her with absolute focus. "Standing by. Mark, 52 seconds, deploying now." The second payload was Sarah's masterpiece, malware that mimicked Golden Ratio's own mathematical signatures so perfectly that their systems would mistake it for legitimate traffic. It was the digital equivalent of speaking their language, walking through their front door, by convincing their security that it belonged there. "They're trying to isolate the intrusion," Lieutenant Park reported, "redirecting to backup servers." "Let them," Sarah said. "Every backup server follows the same Fibonacci structure. They think redundancy makes them stronger. It just gives us more pathways." Master Sergeant Williams monitored the data feeds from NSA's surveillance. "Sir, we're getting reports from St. Petersburg. Their operations center just went dark." Sarah opened her eyes. Not dark, paralyzed. Their command and control network is eating itself, trying to authenticate traffic that looks legitimate but contains instructions that create logical loops. Every security measure they activate makes it worse. On the main display, the operation unfolded exactly as Sarah had predicted. Golden Ratio's sophisticated network, built on mathematical elegance and artistic pride, collapsed under the weight of its own beauty. Within 18 minutes, the group that had terrorized financial institutions, tech companies, and military installations for 3 years was completely neutralized. "We have full access to their servers," Rodriguez reported, his voice carrying a note of awe. "Communication logs, target lists, source code, member identities, everything." "Package it for NSA and FBI," General Hayes ordered. "And make sure our tracks are covered. I want this to look like Golden Ratio collapsed from internal failure, not external attack." Sarah had already thought of that. Her strike had been designed to trigger Golden Ratio's own failsafes, making it appear their network had suffered catastrophic system errors rather than enemy action. Plausible deniability for an operation that had technically violated international law. Admiral Ross appeared on the secure video link from the Pentagon. "Miss Chen, preliminary analysis confirms Golden Ratio is offline. Their planned attack on the Eastern interconnection has been prevented. The President has been briefed. Well done." The operations center erupted in controlled celebration, but Sarah simply sat at her desk, suddenly exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. She just orchestrated the destruction of one of the world's most sophisticated cybercriminal organizations using nothing but pattern recognition and mathematical certainty. Hayes approached as the team celebrated around them. "How do you feel?" Sarah considered the question. "Relieved, sir, tired and," she paused, searching for words, "aware that this changes things." "It does," Hayes agreed. "The Pentagon is already talking about the analog initiative, training elite analysts in your methods, teaching soldiers to think without technological dependence." "Can it be taught?" Sarah asked quietly. "Or did I just get lucky because I grew up without access to the things everyone else relies on?" "I don't know," Hayes admitted. "But we're going to try, because what you represent, a weapon the enemy can't hack, can't predict, can't defend against, that's too valuable not to develop." Sarah looked around the operations center at the sophisticated technology, the computer systems, the digital infrastructure of modern warfare. "I hope we don't forget that technology is still important, sir. I didn't defeat Golden Ratio alone. I needed all of you, all these systems to execute what I could only see in my mind. A hybrid approach, Hayes suggested. Human insight paired with technological capability. Yes, sir. The mind to see what computers can't, the computers to do what minds can't, together. Colonel Rodriguez joined them, carrying a folder marked with the highest security classification. Sarah, NSA just decrypted Golden Ratio's target archive. You were right about the power grid, but he opened the folder. That was just the beginning. They had plans for coordinated attacks on water treatment facilities, air traffic control systems, hospital networks. They were building towards something catastrophic. Sarah took the folder, scanning through the captured plans with growing horror and relief. Then we stopped them just in time. You stopped them, Rodriguez corrected. Don't minimize what you did here. 3 weeks later, the Analog Initiative officially launched with Sarah as its chief instructor. Military analysts learned to calculate in their heads, to visualize complex systems without computers, to think like adversaries who valued elegance over brute force. It was slow, difficult work. Not everyone could do what Sarah did. Some minds simply weren't wired that way. But even those who couldn't match her abilities learned something valuable, that technology was a tool, not a crutch. That the human mind, properly trained, remained warfare's most versatile weapon. Sarah kept her simple desk, her legal pads, her pencils. But now when she sat there with her eyes closed, running invisible calculations through the patterns only she could see, nobody questioned her methods. Nobody doubted her value. She had proven something the military had forgotten in its rush toward technological sophistication. That sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one that's always been there, impossible to detect, impossible to counter, impossible to shut down. The human mind, sharpened to a cutting edge. General Hayes watched from his office as Sarah trained a group of analysts in pattern recognition, using farming metaphors that made classified cyber warfare concepts suddenly comprehensible. She was explaining network topology using irrigation systems, describing malware propagation like weed growth, teaching them to see the mathematics underlying digital chaos. She looked nothing like a traditional military asset, but then the best weapons rarely did. His phone rang, a classified line. Hayes. General, this is Director Chen at NSA. We've identified 17 other threat actors using mathematical signatures in their operations. We need Miss Chen's analysis. Hayes smiled slightly. I'll ask her, but Director, I think you'll need to wait your turn. The farm girl who doesn't need a computer is in high demand these days. As he hung up, Sarah's voice drifted through the open door. The enemy will always try to take away your advantages. Make sure your greatest advantage is something they can't take. She tapped her temple, and the analysts around her nodded with understanding. In the invisible war fought in networks and code, America had found its secret weapon, and it had been hiding in plain sight all along, in the mind of a young woman from Nebraska who'd learned to see patterns in the mathematics of chaos, who'd turned necessity into mastery, and who'd proven that the best defense against sophisticated technology was sophisticated thinking. The base had learned its lesson. The computer systems remained essential, the technology continued advancing. But now, when the next crisis came and the screens filled with red warnings, everyone knew where to look.
Elettrico.
At the simple desk in the corner, where Sarah Chen sat with her
Ah, ho
eyes
capito,
closed,
che
fighting
non è il
battles on a
liceo,
field
è
the enemy
il...
couldn't see, using
si
a
chiamano
weapon they couldn't
istituti, no,
hack.
l'istituto è quello del liceo.
Silent, invisible,
Informativi
unstoppable.
forse? Sai, non mi ricordo come
The
si
end.
chiamavano. Surclassato, perfetto. Poi ho fatto dei video a caso con la telecamera che ho comprato per il casco, ma dato che il casco l'ho lasciato attaccato al motorino, non volevo che qualcuno mi rubasse la telecamera e me la sono portata. Hai fatto bene, credo. Anzi, me la sono portata in classe, certo. Allora, hai fatto bene, sì, sì, hai fatto bene. Io ti faccio diventare Viola di Obo. Io ti faccio diventare Viola di Obo. Ma... no? No, basta con questa classe. Io ho una mancanza di materia grigia all'interno della scatola cranica. No, no, ce l'hai, te l'ho solo rubata io